Welcome to the TrackPad's Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The story of the Wasp and the Hobson begins on a night when the Atlantic seemed endless and impenetrable, the sky overcast and the sea cloaked in shadow. There was no moon to cast a path across the waves, only the dim red lights of a carrier working through the dark, her flight deck alive with launches and recoveries. For the men aboard her escorting destroyer, the Hobson, the routine was as familiar as it was unforgiving. Their mission was simple to describe, yet dangerous to execute. Stay close, keep watch for aircraft in trouble, and be ready to act in seconds if a pilot went into the sea. It was work performed in silence, with every man knowing that small errors could multiply into catastrophe. The mood on the bridges of both ships reflected the dual nature of the night routine wrapped around tension. On the Wasp, the ship's officers concentrated on the intricate ballet of recovering aircraft, a process requiring steady winds across the deck and precise turns to keep aviators aligned with the landing area. On the Hobson, officers of the deck and lookouts fixed their attention on the carrier's great silhouette, ready to mirror her moves and maintain the safety net she required. Sailors on both vessels trusted doctrine, procedure, and training to keep order in the darkness, yet the sea had a way of humbling even the most disciplined formations. Night carrier operations demanded confidence but rewarded humility. Every sailor in the task group understood that visibility was limited, distances deceiving, and speed relentless. Radar screens glowed in combat information centers, their traces offering reassurance that positions were understood, yet nothing could fully eliminate the anxiety of watching a ship of tens of thousands of tons maneuver at speed while your own lay in her path. The great paradox of naval routine was on display. These evolutions had been practiced countless times, yet they carried the same danger every night, regardless of how often they were executed. The seeds of tragedy lay in this tension between routine and risk. Officers trusted their training and orders, believing their interpretation sound, but the dark ocean allowed no forgiveness. Decisions had to be made quickly, and once executed, momentum made them difficult to reverse. It was in this fragile balance, between doctrine and judgment, between procedure and improvisation, that the collision would emerge. The story that unfolded was not merely of steel colliding in the night, but of command itself, the lonely weight of decisions that determined who lived and who did not. Night carrier operations were among the most demanding evolutions in naval life, and on that moonless Atlantic night, every man on watch felt the strain. The absence of natural light left the ocean featureless and deceptive, with the horizon erased and depth perception unreliable. Lookouts leaned into the darkness, straining to separate shadows of ships from the shifting surface of the sea. The sensory world narrowed. Vibrations through the deck plates, the steady hum of engines, and the muted glow of dimmed navigation lights. For some, the monotony dulled alertness, but for the trained sailor, routine was what kept them sharp. Each order given, each report repeated, was another brick in a wall of discipline designed to hold back chaos. Yet beneath that structure of routine lurked the unchanging truth. The sea allowed no margin for error. The tempo of aviation cycles dictated the heartbeat of the task group. Carriers like the Wasp launched and recovered aircraft with relentless rhythm, cycles that left no time for hesitation. Destroyers such as the Hobson lived on that same clock, their mission wholly defined by the carrier's movements. When the carrier demanded speed, escorts matched it without question. When she swung into the wind for recovery, the destroyer had to react instantly, repositioning to remain in station. The destroyer's officers of the deck, quartermasters, and helmsmen became extensions of the carrier's plan, bound by doctrine but guided by judgment. To miss a signal or delay a maneuver was to risk two catastrophes at once: failing to rescue an aviator in distress, or worse, colliding with the very ship they were assigned to guard. The role of the plane guard seemed deceptively simple on paper, but carried immense responsibility in practice. Positioned closest stern or off the carrier's quarter, the destroyer served as a constant sentinel, prepared to rush forward at a moment's notice. Sailors knew this role was more than ceremonial. It was life and death for pilots circling above. At night, the duty became even more perilous, for distance cues blurred and speed felt exaggerated. A turn of a few degrees by the carrier demanded immediate response by the destroyer, lest relative motion carry it into danger. On the Hobson's bridge, watchstanders tracked every subtle change in the carrier's course, balancing routine familiarity with the gnawing awareness that proximity could transform safety into peril in an instant. Underlying the dance of ship and escort was the unforgiving geometry of station-keeping. At 20 knots, two ships could close hundreds of yards in less than a minute, leaving no room for error. Officers calculated bearing drift, advance, and transfer, not as classroom theory but as lived reality, often with nothing more than a compass card, radar sweep, and their own judgment to guide them. What appeared steady to the eye might conceal a slow, deadly convergence invisible until too late. It was a constant mental exercise, gauging whether another vessel was opening, closing, or holding steady, and translating those subtle cues into helm and engine orders. For the destroyer's officers, the carrier's every move had to be mirrored with precision, for misjudgment meant danger not just for their own crew, but for the hundreds aboard the Wasp. Even with doctrine and training, communication remained a fragile thread binding the formation together. Radio circuits were saturated by the chatter of pilots and controllers managing aircraft overhead. Into that noisy environment, maneuvering signals and course changes had to fight for clarity. On paper, the system was robust. Primary and secondary circuits, standardized brevity codes, and the redundancy of light signals. In practice, the night made everything harder. A light might go unseen, a signal might be missed amid overlapping transmissions, and even radar had its limitations when multiple returns crowded the scope. A single garbled order could unleash a chain of assumptions, each one carrying ships further toward danger. The reliance on clarity was total, and when clarity faltered, disaster often followed. Doctrine was the one constant. Every sailor understood that carriers turned into the wind when recovering aircraft. This truth framed the expectations of every escort, guiding how they positioned themselves and how they anticipated maneuvers. But doctrine could not dictate timing, and timing was where risk resided. A turn executed 10 seconds earlier or later could catch an escort off guard or force it to improvise a repositioning maneuver in conditions already fraught with peril. On that night, as the Wasp began her predictable yet decisive turn, the Hobson was forced into the crucible of decision. How her officers interpreted and executed that turn would decide the fate of the ship, and in turn, the lives of those aboard. On the bridge of the Hobson, responsibility for the ship's safety converged on a small team of men working under dim red lights, each with a role that could spell the difference between order and disaster. The captain oversaw the evolution, but the immediate burden rested on the officer of the deck, supported by a junior officer of the deck, a quartermaster at the chart, and the helmsman with his hands on the wheel. Every command had to be sharp, unambiguous, and repeated with precision. At night, when shadows blurred distances and the carrier loomed unpredictably ahead, these men bore the strain of translating doctrine and judgment into rudder angles and engine orders. Behind them, sailors kept logs, tracked times, and monitored equipment, but the bridge itself remained a place where decision and consequence lived side by side. For the men there, every flicker of a light or alteration in the carrier's silhouette demanded total focus. Behind the bridge lay the Combat Information Center, a compartment bathed in the glow of radar screens and plotting tables. Here, another team worked to build the ship's picture of the sea around them. Surface search operators tracked the Wasp's massive radar return, marking its bearing and distance, while other sailors plotted relative motion problems with grease pencils on transparent plotting boards. Ideally, CIC acted as the conscience of the ship, a check against the bridge's judgments, ready to warn if danger approached. But human dynamics often complicated that role. In the heat of operations, with adrenaline running high and confidence in command authority strong, junior sailors sometimes hesitated to challenge a decision or insist on a report. This tension between supporting and questioning shaped many recollections after the collision, when testimony revealed how close CIC had been to recognizing the peril. On the carrier's bridge, perspective was different but no less demanding. The Wasp's officers carried the immense burden of overseeing both ship handling and air operations. Their minds split between the needs of the aviator circling above and the safe navigation of their own vessel through the dark sea. The carrier's turns and speed changes were dictated by the flight deck, not by the escorts astern. What seemed routine from their perspective carried life-or-death consequences for the destroyer struggling to maintain station behind. It was not neglect but asymmetry of responsibility. The Wasp's focus remained on the air wing, while the Hobson's world shrank to the single task of matching her every movement. That imbalance, invisible in daily routine, became critical in the fatal minutes that followed. Doctrine was meant to bridge these gaps. Standard operating procedures for carrier groups laid out clear expectations. Escorts maintained their stations, carriers executed their turns, and communications bound the two together. Yet doctrine could not account for every nuance. Orders given in a pre-sale briefing might be misinterpreted under stress, or forgotten after hours of routine. Standard phrases repeated on radios could be heard differently in the noise of a crowded circuit. Watchstanders often had to choose between strict adherence to procedure and their own judgment of what was safest in the moment. For the Hobson, the decision would fall between interpreting orders literally or acting on what officers believed was intended. That choice, small in the moment, would prove catastrophic in hindsight. Fatigue further eroded judgment. By the time of the collision, many on watch had already endured long hours, their alertness dulled by the ceaseless vibration of machinery, the constant hum of radios, and the stress of operating in close quarters. Darkness played tricks on perception, with ships appearing closer or farther than they truly were, while radar could blur or merge returns at critical moments. Even seasoned officers were vulnerable to illusions, believing they had more room to maneuver than physics allowed. This was the hidden enemy of night operations, not just the sea itself, but the human mind under strain, prone to confirmation bias and tunnel vision. On that night, as helm orders were given and repeated, fatigue and human error became as much a factor as steel and doctrine. Leadership style added another layer to the drama. Some captains encouraged questioning and cross-checking from their subordinates. Others demanded unquestioning obedience. In the Navy of that era, deference to authority was deeply ingrained, and many sailors hesitated to contradict an officer's decision even when their instincts told them otherwise. On the Hobson, this culture meant that when helm orders grew confusing, no one spoke with the force required to challenge them. The command team pressed ahead, confident they understood their position, unaware that momentum had already locked them into a path toward disaster. It was a silence born not of neglect, but of tradition, hierarchy, and the immense weight of responsibility borne in solitude on the bridge of a warship at night. The geometry of the collision began with what should have been a predictable maneuver. The Wasp, preparing to recover aircraft, initiated a turn into the wind. Every escort knew this would come. It was standard procedure, drilled into doctrine and expected by any ship operating alongside a carrier. For the officers on the Hobson's bridge, the turn was not surprising, but it demanded immediate action. The destroyer could not remain in its current position without risking obstruction of the carrier's flight path. A choice had to be made: reposition astern or cut across. What seemed clear in the abstract became dangerously uncertain in the moment, with speed, distance, and visibility conspiring to narrow the margin for safe maneuver. The decision that followed, simple in appearance, catastrophic in execution, would determine the fate of the ship and her crew. From the Hobson's perspective, the maneuver appeared manageable. The plan was to swing across the Wasp's wake and settle into a station on the opposite quarter, a shift performed countless times in plane guard duty. Yet the mathematics of relative motion, so merciless at sea, turned this intention into disaster. A carrier turning at 20 knots carved a sweeping arc into the water, displacing her track outward with tremendous momentum. For the destroyer, this meant that what appeared as open water was in fact a closing funnel, the arc of the carrier's turn intersecting with her projected path. On the bridge, distances seemed greater than they were, angles less acute, and the destroyer's officers believed they had room to maneuver. In reality, they had already entered a corridor from which escape would become nearly impossible. The issue was compounded by confusion in helm orders. Later testimony revealed that a command to the wheel was misheard or misinterpreted, a rudder order repeated back without full understanding of its consequence. Such errors were supposed to be safeguarded by the Navy's repeat-back system, yet repetition meant little if comprehension faltered. In the dark, amid the hum of machinery and the pressure of flight operations, no one challenged the order forcefully enough to stop execution. Once the rudder went over, the destroyer's bow swung across a trajectory that led directly into the Wasp's turn. Every second locked the ship more tightly into the collision course, and the opportunity for correction shrank as momentum built. As the destroyer pressed forward, watchstanders began to sense the peril. The Wasp's bulk grew alarmingly close, her navigation lights shifting at a rate too rapid to be safe. On the Hobson's bridge, alarms of intuition stirred, but by then, geometry was destiny. Emergency rudder orders came, the destroyer heeling sharply as the helmsman strained at the wheel, but 20 knots of steel could not be undone by desperate hands. On the Wasp, lookouts and officers recognized the unfolding disaster with horror. What had seemed routine suddenly transformed into an unavoidable crisis. The destroyer was crossing the bow. Whistles blared, signal lights flashed in warning, but the gap between the two vessels had collapsed to a matter of seconds. The moment of impact was brutal. The Wasp's bow, a wall of armored steel, struck the Hobson with unstoppable force. Metal shrieked as hull plates buckled, bulkheads collapsed, and compartments flooded instantly. Men were thrown from their stations, some crushed in the twisted wreckage, others hurled overboard into the Black Sea. The noise was deafening, a grinding roar that seemed to tear the night apart. For the crew of the Hobson, the routine of station-keeping had ended in chaos, their vessel ripped open by the very ship they were sworn to protect. The geometry of misjudgment had given way to physics, and physics showed no mercy. The seconds after the collision were filled with disbelief and horror on both ships. On the Wasp, the deck shuddered but remained intact, her massive size absorbing the blow. On the Hobson, destruction spread with terrifying speed, water rushing into torn compartments faster than damage control parties could respond. The destroyer's fate was sealed in those moments. Her men left to fight not just for their ship, but for their very survival. In the space of less than a minute, routine maneuvering had turned into catastrophe, and the price of misunderstanding at sea was being paid in steel, blood, and cold Atlantic water. The moment the Wasp's bow tore into the Hobson, the destroyer's fragile frame yielded in an instant. Built for speed and agility, she was no match for the crushing mass of a fleet carrier, and the sound of metal giving way filled the night. Bulkheads groaned and ruptured as compartments crumpled under the force, water rushing into spaces that seconds earlier had been dry and secure. Men in berthing areas were thrown from their racks, while those on watch felt the deck lurch beneath their feet as the ship heeled sharply. Lights flickered and failed, plunging sailors into choking darkness laced with smoke and seawater spray. For the crew, the transition from tense vigilance to full-blown catastrophe was immediate and merciless, leaving no time for disbelief. On the Wasp, the impact was felt as a shudder through her hull, a violent jolt that reverberated up through the decks. Damage control parties, long drilled in the possibility of collision and fire, raced to their stations. The carrier's crew braced for ruptured aviation fuel tanks, broken fire mains, or cascading accidents on the flight deck where planes sat armed and fueled. Officers barked orders to establish flooding boundaries, while medical teams prepared for casualties. It was only when reports confirmed the carrier herself was largely intact that the grim realization took hold. The destroyer had absorbed the devastation. Lookouts shouted of debris in the water, bodies and lifeboats drifting in an oil slick that spread quickly across the waves. The focus shifted in an instant from saving their own ship to rescuing their comrades. For those aboard the Hobson, survival became a matter of instinct. Some were trapped in compartments as water rushed in, pounding bulkheads with terrifying speed. Others clawed their way topside, fighting against tilting decks and blocked passages. Men hurled themselves into the sea as the destroyer's list deepened, many without time to grab life vests or rafts. The Atlantic's cold water was a brutal shock, sapping strength even as sailors kicked free of wreckage and oil. Survivors later spoke of the strange sensory blur dark water filled with fuel, the cries of men calling for shipmates, and the glow of searchlights cutting across the waves as they fought to stay afloat. The destroyer, their home and protector, had become their tomb and their battlefield, in the space of a heartbeat. Rescue efforts began with desperate speed. On the Wasp, whaleboats were swung out and dropped into the sea, crews rowing hard through oil-stained swells to reach survivors. Nets were flung over the carrier's sides, and strong arms hauled soaked sailors onto the safety of steel decks. Other destroyers in the screen converged, their own boats lowering into the water, officers shouting through megaphones as searchlights swept the wreckage field. Sailors risked their lives diving into the sea to reach shipmates struggling to stay above water, pulling them onto rafts or clinging to lines tossed from rescuing vessels. On deck, medics worked without pause, cutting away oil-soaked clothing, wrapping shivering bodies in blankets, and treating lacerations and broken bones with grim efficiency. Yet the ocean's toll was undeniable. Despite heroic rescue efforts, many men were lost within the first minutes, trapped below decks or dragged down by the sinking destroyer. Others succumbed to the cold and exhaustion before help could reach them. By dawn, the count of survivors and the list of missing began to take shape, transforming shock into mourning. The mess decks of the Wasp became improvised wards, sailors lying on cots under the glow of hanging lamps while shipmates moved among them, checking pulses and offering comfort. The air was thick, with the smell of oil and seawater, a reminder of the chaos that had engulfed them. The night had begun with routine flight operations. It ended with shattered steel, a crippled task group, and a ship's company decimated by disaster. The psychological impact lingered even as rescue efforts subsided. Survivors spoke in quiet tones of comrades lost, of moments when escape seemed impossible, and of the haunting cries that echoed across the water long after the destroyer had disappeared beneath the waves. The Hobson's crew, once a tight-knit family at sea, was broken apart in an instant. On the carrier and across the task group, silence replaced routine chatter. Officers and sailors alike grappled with the sudden shift from routine duty to calamity, each man carrying with him images he would never forget. Steel had met steel in the dark, but the true damage was measured in lives forever altered by a collision that should never have happened. By the time the wreckage of the Hobson had settled beneath the waves, the Navy was already preparing the next battle, the battle for understanding. Tragedies at sea were never left unexplained, for each carried lessons that might prevent repetition. Within days, a board of inquiry convened, assembling officers, navigators, and technical experts to reconstruct the night's events. Logs were collected, CIC plots reviewed, and surviving officers summoned to testify under oath. What had seemed to the sailors a blur of confusion and instinct was now dissected with cold precision. Every rudder order, every course change, every communication across circuits became a puzzle piece in a mosaic of failure. The board's purpose was not merely to assign blame, but to ensure that no other ship would share the Hobson's fate. Yet for those who had lived it, the process reopened wounds still raw from loss. The inquiry quickly zeroed in on seamanship. Doctrine had been clear. A plane guard destroyer must never attempt to cross a carrier's bow during flight operations. The cardinal rule had been broken, whether by misinterpretation, poor judgment, or both. Testimony from bridge officers revealed confusion over helm commands, some insisting they had understood the order correctly, others acknowledging ambiguity. The carrier's maneuver itself was standard, executed in accordance with procedure for recovering aircraft. The destroyer's response was the anomaly. In the final analysis, the board declared that the Hobson's decision to cross the Wasp's bow was the decisive error, a violation of doctrine compounded by human misjudgment. For officers across the fleet, this conclusion struck like a hammer. No matter how experienced a crew might be, the laws of seamanship were absolute, and breaking them carried the highest price. But seamanship alone could not explain the catastrophe. Communication emerged as the other critical weakness. The crowded radio circuits, saturated with the demands of flight operations, left little bandwidth for maneuvering clarification. Maneuvering signals intended to reduce ambiguity were either missed in the dark or interpreted too late to be useful. Witnesses described orders being repeated mechanically but not challenged when unclear. The board identified this as a systemic flaw. The tools for clarity existed, but the culture of unquestioned obedience and the pressures of the moment meant they were not applied with rigor. In its recommendations, the inquiry demanded reforms, stricter adherence to repeat-back procedures, mandatory confirmation of helm orders, and clearer protocols for maneuvering signals at night. The lessons were painful, but they became embedded in the Navy's operating fabric. Training reforms followed swiftly. Officers of the deck, once trained primarily in daytime navigation and surface evolutions, now faced expanded regimens that emphasized night operations, relative motion, and the geometry of carrier group maneuvering. CIC teams were drilled to be more assertive in challenging the bridge if plots showed danger. Wardrooms across the fleet held long discussions on the Hobson's fate, turning the tragedy into a case study. Young officers learned early that confidence could not replace precision, and that hesitation to question orders could be as dangerous as incompetence. The Hobson became not just a ship lost, but a symbol, a reminder that seamanship demanded vigilance, clarity, and humility. Even when fatigue and routine dulled the edge of caution, the cultural impact of the collision rippled far beyond immediate reforms. Sailors across the Navy came to view night operations with a heightened respect for risk. Commanding officers, once prone to relying heavily on their judgment, became more open to listening to junior voices from CIC or the bridge team. The loss of the Hobson underscored that accidents were not the fault of one man alone, but of a system that had to be tuned to perfection. This subtle recalibration of culture was perhaps the most enduring outcome of the inquiry. Even decades later, officers spoke of the collision in wardrooms and classrooms, reminding new generations that the sea remained unforgiving, and that even the most routine operations demanded total vigilance. The collision between the Wasp and the Hobson became more than a story of steel torn apart in the night. It evolved into a lesson about the human dimension of command. At sea, no order exists in a vacuum. A helm command, a change in station, or a signal to maneuver carries with it the weight of hundreds of lives, yet must be delivered and executed in seconds. This burden falls heaviest on the commanding officer, but it radiates outward to every sailor on watch. The officer of the deck interprets orders. The helmsman translates them into rudder angles. CIC plots them on glowing boards, and lookouts strain their eyes into the dark. Each role seems small until the moment clarity fails, and then the entire chain is tested. The Hobson's loss showed how fragile that chain could be when initiative clashed with doctrine. The balance between obedience and initiative lay at the heart of the disaster. Doctrine insisted that a destroyer never cross a carrier's bow during flight operations. Yet, in the moment, faced with the carrier's sudden turn, officers on the Hobson believed they were executing their duties by repositioning. Their initiative, intended to maintain the plane guard station, instead placed them on a collision course. The lesson that emerged was stark. Initiative at sea was valuable, but only when anchored to unwavering adherence to fundamental rules of seamanship. The tragedy underscored that officers must distinguish between the flexibility of judgment and the rigidity of doctrine. Commanders learned that confidence in one's interpretation could not override the absolute geometry of the sea. Human fallibility threaded through every account of that night. Fatigue dulled judgment, assumptions replaced clarity, and deference to authority stifled questions that might have averted disaster. Survivors later recalled moments when orders seemed unclear, when hesitation filled the air, and yet no one challenged the direction being taken. This silence was not born of negligence, but of culture. In a navy that prized obedience, young officers and enlisted men often swallowed doubts rather than risk contradiction. The Hobson taught a generation that silence could be deadly, and that the courage to speak against confusion was as vital as the courage to face enemy fire. In training and in wardrooms, this human lesson became as enduring as any procedural reform. For survivors, the lessons were personal and haunting. They remembered comrades lost to flooding compartments, the cries of men in the water, and the smell of oil and seawater mingled on their clothing for weeks. They carried the memory of orders given and repeated, of lights flashing too late, and of the helpless realization that steel momentum could not be reversed. Their testimony lent human weight to the cold language of inquiry reports. It ensured that the Hobson would not be remembered solely as a ship lost, but as a community of men whose sacrifices reshaped the Navy's understanding of leadership. Through their voices, the loss became more than a technical error. It became a reminder of the human cost of command decisions. The collision's legacy reached into the modern era, long after the technology of navigation evolved. Satellites, GPS, and digital communications changed the tools, but not the essence of the burden. Modern officers learned the same truth the Hobson's crew had lived. No matter how advanced the equipment, the clarity of human decision-making remained the ultimate safeguard. Commanders today still study the collision as a warning, recognizing that fatigue, assumption, and miscommunication remain constant enemies. The sea does not forgive, and steel does not yield, regardless of the century. The story of the Hobson remains an enduring reminder that leadership at sea is not about routine, but about vigilance, humility, and the constant recognition that lives hinge on clarity in the dark. The loss of the Hobson was more than a naval mishap. It was a moment that reshaped the understanding of command at sea. In the cold arithmetic of ships, movements, one mistake was enough to end a vessel's life and claim scores of sailors. Yet beyond the numbers, the story carried weight because it revealed the fragile balance between routine and catastrophe. Carriers and their escorts had performed these evolutions countless times, and yet, in one night, doctrine, communication, and judgment faltered together. The sea punished the lapse without hesitation. In the Navy's long tradition, this tragedy became a cautionary tale, retold to ensure that the men lost would not be forgotten, and that their deaths would leave behind something more than sorrow. For the sailors who survived, the memory of that night never dimmed. They carried with them the shock of impact, the cries of their shipmates, and the chilling blackness of the Atlantic closing around them. Many spoke of the haunting silence afterward, when the task group pressed on with one ship missing from formation. For them, the lesson was written not in manuals or inquiries, but in lived experience. The sea demanded humility, discipline, and constant vigilance. Their voices ensured that the Hobson's fate became more than a line in a report. It became part of the living memory of the fleet. In the decades that followed, reforms were enacted, doctrines sharpened, and training intensified, but the essence of the lesson remained unchanged. Technology advanced, giving sailors better tools to judge distance, speed, and bearing, yet the collision reminded everyone that machines could not replace judgment. Whether in 1952 or in the digital age, command remained a profoundly human art, vulnerable to fatigue, assumption, and silence. The Hobson's story underscored that the responsibility of leadership could never be automated, for clarity of thought and decisiveness in action would always decide the line between safety and catastrophe. Ultimately, the legacy of the Hobson is one of remembrance and instruction. Her men, both those lost and those who survived, left behind a lesson that continues to guide officers of the deck and commanding officers today. The sea is merciless, but its dangers can be mastered by vigilance, humility, and unwavering adherence to the principles of seamanship. In every wardroom where the story is told, in every training exercise where repeat backs are drilled, and in every late-night watch when fatigue whispers in the ear, the memory of the Hobson stands as a silent guardian. It reminds the Navy that even in darkness, clarity must prevail, For command at sea is not simply about giving orders. It is about bearing their weight.
Thank you for joining us on the TrackPad's Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.